We acknowledge that we record this show on the land of the Piramonk people and pay our respects to their elders past and present. G'day comrades, g'day Liz.
Hey.
Thanks for joining us as we continue our Consciousness 101 series. Last time out we read Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat, and we met, well, a lot of issues, didn't we, Liz?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the key issues that we'll pick up on today and the next two sessions in Consciousness 101 is has to do with Nagel's worry that the essential nature of consciousness is its subjective character, that is, its occurrence to a particular point of view. This we contrasted to how we try to understand and explain phenomena where we move from a subjective understanding of it to an objective one. And we talked about how that involved a couple of different senses of the word subjective and objective. So we were left wondering at the end of our reading of Nagel, how do we begin to get an objective understanding of consciousness, and if indeed that is possible. Dennett is one of those who have taken on this challenge directly, and so we'll be making use of his paper, Who's on First? Heterophenomenology Explained, from 2003 to see how he does that. Now, Liz, I've chosen one of the slightly more recent presentations of heterophenomenology and his approach to measuring and understanding consciousness rather than his initial presentation, because he thinks that there were some misunderstandings that arose from his initial presentation, so he's tried to clarify those in this paper.
Right, because he's still not brilliantly understood, so...
Indeed. I think, this is an issue that does come up a lot. Dennett, especially once he started using terms like illusionism to describe his position, like the bite-size, easily digestible catchphrases of the position became quite misleading. And Liz, we've talked about this quite a few times before, about how his lovely literary style, which is great to read in his popular books, does sometimes obscure exactly the argument that he's making.
Yeah, he's easy to read, but surprisingly hard to understand. It's a very strange combination.
This paper from Dennett is taking on Nagel's challenge relatively directly, and he's going to offer us an objective, or his preferred terminology is third-person description of consciousness. He calls this heterophenomenology, which is just literally what, Liz? Do you know what the prefix hetero means?
Other.
Other, exactly. So this is just phenomenology of the other. So the term just means trying to understand the lived experiences of someone other than yourself. To know what he's on about here, Liz, we need to know what phenomenology is as well.
Oh, that was the question I was just about to ask.
So what is phenomenology?
I'm going to say what it's like, but it's the study of experiences. I actually don't know.
Yeah, I don't think the confusion just comes from you, because it is a term that's used differently in different parts of philosophy. So it refers, it can be used to refer to a specific tradition of philosophy associated with Husserl, but Dennett is trying to use it in the more general sense, which is just what you said, Liz, which is the study of appearances or of experiences.
Study of appearances, I like that.
So then we put the prefix together with the prefix hetero together with phenomenology, and we just have the study of how things appear to or are experienced by someone other than the self.
Isn't that what the phenomenologists in the 1800s were doing? Studying how things appear to other people, or was it more introspective?
So the stuff that's in Husserl's tradition is about identifying the structure of experience, and by structure they mean something quite specific. So they're talking about the parts of experience and the relations between them.
I was actually thinking more of the precursors to psychophysics.
Okay, so
Were they called phenomenologists or not?
no, so you get the term psychophysics from that period, from Helmholtz and so on. This is a really good segue, Liz, because I have been recently looking at public domain works on consciousness, and there's a lot of fun stuff from the 1800s that we should read.
Cool.
And so maybe once we got through this 101 section, do another 102 section on all the experiments that someone who wants to go into consciousness research should know how to do. Then do a section on our research. After that, we could do some history stuff for fun as well.
Cool.
But yeah, so the psychophysicists, then I suppose you're thinking of Helmholtz and that group. I don't read German, so I don't have a great knowledge of them. But they lived at a time when doing natural philosophy meant that you could study a bit of all of the things that were gradually becoming sciences. And I think that they recognized things like physicists had quite a lot to say about light before it reached the eye, and they wanted to know what happened after that.
Oh, you can't swim if you press 3. Sorry.
True. But yes, they are then trying to study why things appear the way they do to someone. And indeed, Dennett says things in this paper like, when I try and tell psychologists that heterophenomenology is a method, they're just like, what? That's just what you do. What else would you do? And so it's very much, I think Dennett's aim is very much about trying to inform philosophers working in the tradition of Nagel about the kinds of approaches that were already being used by those in psychology working in the tradition that Helmholtz was part of.
Cool. That's really useful for me to realise, because I, in my very fragile old memory, had not remembered that he's saying, hey, this is what everyone does anyway.
Alright, so back to how he's setting it up. He's wanting to give a third-person description of experience. How, in general, can this be done? Well, Dennett suggests like this. This is a quote. Experiments in which human subjects collaborate with experimenters, making suggestions, interacting verbally, telling what it is like. End quote. So the approach here boils down to interpreting the speech acts of subjects in experiments, these being the reports, questions, corrections, requests, etc. that subjects make about their experiences in experimental setups.
You mean you ask people
what
it's like for them?
Yes. And indeed, those reports of experiences, for example, getting someone to say what they see, or pushing a button when they see something in particular that we're asking them to focus on, are the most important of the kinds of speech acts Dennett is interested in.
So why is calling them speech acts important?
I think all he wants at this stage is just a term that can include reports of experience, but also these other things. So asking questions and things like that, which aren't reports of experience as such, but from which we might still be able to infer what subjects believe about their experience.
So when the person whose experience is being interrogated asks a question?
Yes, that's right.
When the subject asks a question?
When the subject asks a question or requests clarification, makes a suggestion about what things could be going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But really, it's just the words they say.
Taken together, these speech acts compose, this is a quote again, compose a catalogue of what the subject believes to be true about his or her conscious experience. End quote. This is, for Dennett, a representation of the world according to the subject. This is what he calls the heterophenomenological world. Now, we're going to start to get to where Dennett's understanding of this becomes a little bit controversial, because for Dennett, it's these beliefs about experience that constitute the subjectivity of the person.
The beliefs about the experience, not the experience itself.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
So I believe that I am now standing in front of a white Minecraft bed. That's the source of the subjectivity, not the thing going on in the visual parts of my brain.
Yes, so what we'll get to as we move through Dennett's argument is ultimately it's your belief that that's what you see that needs to be explained. There's another question that arises from what we were just talking about, which is not the what is belief question, but what is the subjectivity here? Is this the same thing as what Nagel meant by the subjective character of consciousness? What do you think, Liz?
I'm worried it's not. It seems to be building in a two-layer view of consciousness. So there's the experience and then there's your beliefs about it. And to the extent that what it is likeness can be independent of your beliefs about it, you might be missing the phenomenon. But he is tackling directly the thing that Nagel thinks is hard about what it is likeness.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is what it's like for the subject.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I do think he is pitching it at subjective character, but we're starting to see a revision of the concept, because certainly when Nagel says subjective character, he's not tying that explicitly to beliefs about what I experience. So we're seeing that as soon as we're starting to move from initial pre-theoretical ideas about things that Nagel has towards how can we start to measure consciousness and understand consciousness in other people, we're immediately requiring some revision of our concepts. There's some inadequacy of what we start with.
You need to begin to unpack the thing that you're studying in order to be able to explain it. You can't just say it's that thing.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
I mean something slightly stronger than that. I do mean that in part. But I think that it would be possible for Nagel or someone who really liked Nagel's initial analysis to say, offer a different account of subjective character that isn't tied to belief.
Yes. It's not just that you need to begin to unpack it, but hey, note this is one unpacking and there might be others. And so often you'll find philosophers arguing about whether in unpacking something they've left it behind.
Yes, and we see that often in objections to Dennett, by talking about beliefs, he's leaving behind the thing that we're interested in.
And so it's really important to carefully examine the moves that Dennett makes in going from one to the other to see if it has been left behind.
For now, we want to just try and get our head around this initial approach to measuring consciousness in other people.
So the point I want to make that I think is important is, if you're new to the area, you might be feeling, oh my God, he's already changed the topic. It's fine to have that feeling, but you need to sort of hang on for the ride and test whether that initial feeling is correct when you see how he goes about explaining the move he's making.
So let's have a look and see the moves that he makes and see whether or not we think this will be a legitimate move. So from what we were saying, Dennett is suggesting that the heterophenomenological world is a set of beliefs about experience. to make sense of this claim, we need to know what beliefs are. Dennett offers his own account of belief in terms of a kind of explanatory attitude we take toward ourselves, indeed to each other, to dogs, etc., etc. As with a lot of Dennett, this is dressed up in some very strong sounding language, which can rather make it sound like he thinks there are no such thing as beliefs. But I'd like to be more cautious in our reading, whilst acknowledging that this is one of the places where understanding Dennett can be very difficult and can seem to imply tensions or even contradictions that aren't there if we try and read more closely. Let's see how these concerns arise. Dennett says that beliefs are theorist fictions. This isn't like an accidental thing where he's being a bit loose. He puts these terms in italics for emphasis, so presumably he really means it when he says they're fictions. But if beliefs are fictions, doesn't that mean they don't really exist?
It would seem to be the case.
Yeah.
Does Alice in Wonderland really exist?
So I think
that would seem to be the obvious reading.
That would seem to be the obvious reading. This is what I mean about it's dressed up in quite strong language, because I think it's uncharitable to read it as saying that beliefs have the same status as the white rabbit in the waistcoat.
Theorist is important there.
Yeah.
So theoretical fictions are different from literary fictions.
So I think what Dennett's really trying to emphasise here is the abstracting and simplifying work done by positing beliefs. So the other examples of theorist fictions he gives it are things like the centre of gravity of an object, or how we quantify physical properties on numerical scales.
So they're more like a simplification or an abstraction than a fiction.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So we might give, for example, the speed of an object in meters per second or miles per hour. In either case, we are describing a physical property of the object, its speed relative to some reference frame, by relating it to a number. What is fictional about that? Well, I think based largely on how Dennett emphasises words here, it's that the use of an abstract thing, in this case a number, to describe a real property of something is what's fictional. He's saying the number as such doesn't exist in the object.
Right.
Yeah.
So me walking at 1 kilometre an hour, I'm not one in some sense.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Why did he have to use fiction?
Yeah.
It's really like abstraction is
fine.
perfectly
Yeah,
fine, and I think would set people off in a more productive direction. Is there a reason why we can't swap fiction for
abstraction? Yeah, I think I'd be happy to do that. So I'm thinking about this, we can use two different numbers to describe exactly the same property of something. So we can say 10 or approximately 22.4 to describe something's speed, depending on what scale we're finding useful, whether we're wanting to use meters a second or miles per hour. So are you happy to say they're theorists' abstractions if we use numbers like that?
Maybe we should just say tools, because I don't want to say that they are abstract. Abstract means something more in my head than tools.
Yeah.
So they're tools.
Yeah. So it's a...
Not in the mean sense.
Yeah. One way to think about this that's potentially useful is that the theorist fictions in Dennett's sense are ways of describing something that are useful for studying them.
I like that.
Yeah.
So tool. Can we call them tools?
Yeah.
Because tools are useful.
Yeah, theorist tools.
Theorists' tools.
Yeah, and so then when we say assign the number 10 or approximately 22.4 to something, we're describing that for understanding its speed, but we don't have to say that the number 10 literally exists in that object. For Dennett, beliefs have a sort of analogous structure to describing things like this. Instead of relating a property of something to a number to describe it, they relate a subject's internal state to a proposition, where a proposition is a kind of abstract way of representing the subject's internal state.
Better tell someone what a proposition is.
Yes. So I was just about to ask you to do that.
Oh, God, I don't know.
So a proposition you can think of as like an abstract form of a sentence. If we say a sentence like, the black dog that we own is lying on the couch, or we say Beethoven is lying on the couch, or we say the goodest girl is on the couch and she's lying down, those are all different sentences, but they all have the same underlying proposition. So the proposition is a way of thinking of the abstract form of the representation rather than the thing in the world.
Right. So think of propositions. If you think of propositions as sentences that aren't questions, are you in the right ballpark?
Yeah.
That's how I tend to think of them.
Yeah.
But I know that that's not precise.
Yeah, and there are more precise definitions of proposition and so on that we need for doing certain kinds of logic and so on. But for understanding what Dennett's getting at, that's good enough. Why is this important for Dennett? Well, he takes it that attributing propositions to things is our normal way of explaining behaviour when we don't know all the details of the causal mechanism. Our starting point to understanding why someone goes online and orders a pizza is not to understand the physiology of hunger or all of the perceptual or brain systems involved in knowing how to read a menu, how to make a credit card payment, etc. We can abstractly represent those internal states as a feeling of hunger and believing that the local pizza place makes decent or at least moderately acceptable pizza. A lot of social science, Dennett claims, is aimed at getting better explanations of this type. For those who have read other parts of Dennett's scholarship, they'll recognise this as the intentional stance. So when we offer this kind of explanation of someone's behaviour, so why they go online and order pizza, for Dennett, we can still say it's true that they believe the local pizza place is pretty decent, but it would be a mistake to infer from the mere usefulness of that description that there really is an internal state which corresponds exactly to being a belief of that form.
So I find thinking about dogs useful here. Fives follows us around when we feed Beethoven because he believes she's getting better food than him. She's not, she's just getting food with some medicine in it. Now, while that's a really useful way to describe Fives' behaviour, it doesn't mean he actually has a sentence in his head, Beethoven is getting better food.
I think that's quite the sort of thing that Dennett's on about. So again, if we're positioning this in philosophical context, if you've ever read Foda's work on the propositional attitudes and the hypothesis that they're instantiated in a form of mentalese or a mental language, Dennett is rejecting that kind of theory of belief. There are lots of arguments, of course, to be had about how well this works as a theory of belief, but we don't need to worry about that today, because we're just trying to understand Dennett's claim that the subjective world is a set of beliefs about what is experienced. And when he's making that claim and saying beliefs about what is experienced, he means beliefs in this sense. The upshot of this, Liz, and I think this is again a point about how hard it can be to understand Dennett sometimes, because I'm about to sum up that whole sort of confusing circular conversation we had as for Dennett, the beliefs we infer from the subject's reports need not necessarily correspond to real internal states of the brain, or whatever our theory of consciousness says. They're just a kind of abstract shorthand for describing the subject's subjective point of view.
Right, and I think that's consistent with the point I was just about to make. He's defining beliefs in a technical sense for use in a theory of consciousness. You might also think there's a sense of belief which is in the subject's head. He ain't talking about it in that way.
So we start to get a handle on what is being said in this paper. Now, the obvious objection to this, of course, is, we've already mentioned it, that my beliefs about my experiences are not the same as the experiences themselves. And isn't it the experiences themselves that a theory of consciousness should explain? Dennett cites Levine as one who offered this objection to his initial presentation of heterophenomenology, but there are plenty of others as well. In trying to understand consciousness, we should, so this objection goes, understand the experiences directly as themselves, not indirectly via our beliefs about them.
This is where the analogy with numbers to measure speed is useful.
Cool. Yeah.
It just makes that look silly.
Dennett is taking this objection on directly, and his response here is that there's no pre-theoretical way to catalogue the experiences themselves. By catalogue the experience, this is a new term. I think what he means here is just there isn't a theory-neutral way to list and describe experiences themselves. So he asks us to consider 4 things that we might want to explain. These are A, conscious experiences themselves. That's what the objector here is pointing at. Beliefs about these experiences is B. C is verbal judgments expressing those beliefs. And D is utterances of one sort or another. So that's a list of 4 things that we might want to explain. Dennett is saying we should explain B, the beliefs about experience. That's what we were just talking about, Liz.
Yeah.
Yeah. Objectors like Levine want us to go past this to A, the conscious experiences themselves.
Why does he list the other things?
Because those are the things that you can get, that you can observe from another person. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you observe that someone is uttering. You observe that their utterance is a verbal judgment. One thing that we did talk about when we were talking about Nagel is whether or not one can be wrong about one's own experiences. So does it make sense to say, I'm wrong about how things appear to me, is a question that Nagel raised. Now, if our answer to that is no, it's not possible to be wrong about how things appear to you yourself, then it should always be possible to get a complete and accurate set of beliefs about what you experience. So there would be, in effect, no difference between explaining experiences themselves and our beliefs about those experiences, because you always believe you experience what you actually do. Now, Dennett doesn't explicitly consider this option, which might be a bit of sleight of hand in the argument. What he does consider here is the possibility that A outruns B, meaning you experience more than you believe you do, or B outruns A, meaning that you believe you have experiences that you don't in fact have. In both of these instances, he says that explaining B is the better option. So explaining the beliefs about experiences is the better option than trying to explain the experiences themselves. So if you believe you have experiences that you don't actually have, then explaining only the experiences you do have will leave out why you have that extra belief. And the other case, if you have experiences you don't believe you do, then there are experiences that are neither accessible to you as the believer or to the scientist to whom you are trying to report those experiences.
So?
Yeah, I think what's lurking in the background here is the worry that it doesn't make sense to ask what are my experiences really like as opposed to how they appear to me, which is why I wanted to bring in that hidden option. So if you grant that premise, then you might think that supposed cases of experiencing things you don't believe you experience should be understood as unconscious processing and not properly experiences at all.
So you've got the belief, you've got the experience. You say, oh, there's an experience there, but I can't quite capture it and put it into words.
Yep.
And he says, I want to explain your belief, not the experience. So what's his reason now for saying, so totally, if there's no experience to explain, of course it's better to explain the belief.
Mm-hmm.
But when the experience outstrips what you can put into words, why is explaining what you can put into words better?
The main part of this argument is this part, that if that was the case, then it would mean if there really was an experience there that you can't put into words, it would mean that there is an experience which isn't accessible to you or to anyone talking to you.
Why is putting into words the only form of accessibility?
This is a good question.
Okay. So I'm thinking there's this form of pain I have, and this is going to sound so bizarre, that in some sense is like biting metal, the taste of biting metal, but it actually has no taste at all. Now, I can tell you when I do and don't have that aspect to my pain, but I know that those words I just said are pretty gibberish and really don't capture the experience, and that there's something more to the experience than I could put into words. It's like it has the shape of what biting metal tastes like. So my point being, I can tell you when I do have pain with that and when I don't, but I really frickin' don't think anything I just said makes any sense, and I think that my experience outstrips what I just communicated to you.
Dennett's going to bite the bullet here.
Right, okay, cool.
And he's going to say that there isn't anything there. There is no quality there that you're having a hard time describing that needs to be explained, but we need to explain why you think that and why you think that there is something to your experience which goes beyond exactly what you can put into words.
Right. So I guess I've just remembered all of the technical stuff. So something that you can't put into words is called ineffable. And so Dennett will bite the bullet and deny the existence of ineffable aspects of experience.
Yep.
I personally think putting into words is a very coarse measure, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, that's quite right. And I think as we start to move through the next two episodes, when we look at alternative descriptions of experience that aren't based on just what you can put into words, it does turn out to be possible that there is something there to be explained and that is describable in a different way. That way, of course, being quality spaces, which we'll come to.
But I admire Dennett for biting the bullet, because the one thing you can hope for the most in philosophy is being internally consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Was that bizarro talk about my pain useful?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, no, because I was just reading through that and I'm like, oh, fuck, I haven't written an example for this, so I hope this comes up with
now, this is something that I've been thinking about a bit that I haven't articulated.
Yeah.
But yeah, wait a minute. No, when I've got visceral pain, it has the shape of the taste of when metal hits my old-fashioned filling.
Yeah, right.
It's weird as fuck.
All right, so in our conversation there, Liz, we were trying to give a bit of context for where Dennett ends up in his theorising. But I just want to emphasise here that at this point, Dennett's being quite neutral about the status of these purported experiences themselves that underlie our beliefs about them. The effect of Dennett's argument at this point is just that we should treat subjects' beliefs about what they experience as constitutive of their subjective world. That's what they can tell us about.
As part of, but not exhaustive. Because it's the exhaustive claim that I think is theory dependent.
Dennett's recommending that we treat the subject's beliefs about what they experience as constitutive of their subjective world, of their heterophenomenological world, but we should reserve judgment as to whether or not those beliefs are true or well-grounded. So we're reserving judgment as to the status of the purported experiences underlying those beliefs. And so we are reserving judgment as to whether or not the beliefs are wholly constitutive of the subjective world.
Cool.
Now, I want to link this back to the sorts of conceptual revisions that Nagel was asking to, because I think here we see some more evidence in the text, though it is somewhat indirect, that Dennett doesn't think that we can ask what experiences are like as opposed to how they seem to the subject. This quote is originally from Consciousness Explained, the 1991 book, but it's repeated here. So, quote, "You are not authoritative about what is happening in you, but only about what seems to be happening in you. And we are giving you total dictatorial authority over the account of how it seems to you, about what it is like to be you." End quote. So taken out of context, this quote seems directly relevant. But in the context, Dennett here is talking about including the belief that there is something about experiences which we can't put into words. So that's the ineffability stuff. How do you describe what red is like to someone who is red-green colorblind, for example? Putting that belief about ineffability into the set of beliefs that need to be explained about consciousness. That's the context where the quote is made there, but I think it is giving us this sort of textual evidence that what seems to be happening in you isn't something that you can be wrong about.
So Dennett thinks that you can't be wrong about what it seems like?
I think that the above argument that we talked about, whether experience outruns belief or belief outruns experience, implies that he thinks this, and that this quote implies that he thinks this. But he doesn't just come out and say it, but I think that it will be important when we get to understanding his theory of consciousness later on. But for now, I think where we're going is going to depend on this answer to Nagel, that no, it doesn't make sense to ask what your experiences really are as opposed to how they seem to you. Alright, so we're getting a very general approach to consciousness. In effect, we're being asked to listen to what a bunch of people say they experience, interpret that into a coherent set of beliefs, and explain that. Now, this is so general that some people think it includes too much, but this seems to be by design. Dennett wants to be able to extend work already done in psychology to the study of consciousness, and we'll see an example of that in a moment. What he wants to exclude is any approach that relies on a researcher just saying what their own experiences are without considering anyone else's. Why shouldn't we just have a researcher say what their own experiences are and not consider anyone else's? The main objection here seems to just be a restatement of Nagel, that only considering how things appear to oneself isn't science. He claims that things that are often called first-person methods in practice are heterophenomenological methods because they involve researchers asking questions like, what were you thinking when you, or how were you feeling when you and that's doing some task. Why exactly just relying on one's own experience isn't good is not argued for here, perhaps because he thinks it's so obviously bad practice. He says, quote, "It's not an attractive option for familiar reasons," end quote. The familiar reasons would be like the failure of the introspectionists to come up with consistent descriptions of experience.
Within one person?
Yeah. Yes, within one person and between subjects.
So can you do heterophenomenology about yourself? And that's different from introspection?
If you're remaining neutral as to why you believe what you believe about your experiences. If you're not trying to infer from the fact that you believe that you experience something to you, there is really an internal state which is the experience of that exactly as I believe it to be.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're skeptical.
Yeah.
So it's skepticism about what the belief is about that's necessary.
Yes.
So so the reason I'm asking the question is because Nagel says as soon as you take the objective stance, you are leaving the phenomenon you're trying to explain behind. So I want to understand why that complaint doesn't apply to Dennett. Because I don't think it does.
Because he's offering a reconceptualization of the subjective.
Yeah, but you can't just do introspection. In doing that, he's not performing a sleight of hand and leaving the subjective behind. You can do introspection, but just remember it's not reliable.
But also more generally, like if you were to do that, at most you could explain your own experiences, and what we want to be able to explain is everyone's, not just yours.
Right.
And, other things about, the quality of evidence in psychology is what he's talking about. Because what he wants to establish here is that the normal methods of psychology as it was being done at these times can just be naturally extended to include consciousness.
So sure, you can go off and do homophenomenology, but you ain't going to be explaining much.
Yeah. You can't get a generalizable theory of human consciousness just from thinking about yourself. It has to be able to apply to everyone. Alright, so we've spent a lot of time going around in circles trying to get a charitable reading of Dennett and see what sorts of revisions to our concepts and answers to Nagel's questions that he's giving us. And where we've ended up is somewhere sort of straightforward and boring, which is just that the usual approaches to the study of the mind in psychology can be extended to consciousness.
Oh, and this is why everyone hates philosophers of mind.
Yeah, this is why philosophers have no friends.
Because it takes us a whole paper to state the obvious.
It is always worth challenging the obvious, though, because many things seem obvious but are wrong. Alright, so let's get an example of heterophenomenology at work.
Oh no, am I going to have to do mental rotation? I just realised that I'm so bad at mental rotation that I made these blocks very similar.
That is okay. What Dennett's trying to establish with these examples is that research in psychology, when he was developing these ideas, was in fact often just neutral as to whether or not people experience what they believe they experience. So he gives an example of some work on mental rotation studies from the 1970s and 80s. Liz, this is an example of something we can actually build in Minecraft, and I believe you have prepared us some shapes similar to those used in the experiments.
Yep.
So get those up on screen.
There you go.
For those who aren't using the screen,
Tetris blocks.
They're not really necessary. They're just 3D Tetris shapes, basically. In these studies, and you'll probably look at something like this if you ever study psychology as an undergrad, people are shown two shapes, like the ones that Liz has got there, and just asked if they are the same or different.
They are different.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Do we trust your rotation skills? Maybe actually walk around it to show them.
Well, there's two shapes, and one is 4 blocks high and one is 3 blocks high. Yes, I am sure.
Excellent. All right, so we get something interesting about consciousness from these studies when we do the heterophenomenology and ask people how they work out whether or not the shapes were the same or different. So,
the inside joke is I'm horrifically bad at mental rotation. Incredibly bad. Which is why you can spin me around and I'll be lost.
So there are big individual differences in this skill, which is obviously something that psychologists explore, but also relevant here for Dennett is just how do people think they do this task? So a lot of people say that they imagined rotating the shapes in their mind and seeing if they lined up or not. Indeed, in the studies in the 70s and 80s, it was found that how long it takes to identify a match depends on how rotated the shapes are. So if the shape match and are rotated by 90 degrees, it takes longer to identify a match than if they're rotated by 30 degrees.
I don't do that. Which is why I'd be the annoying one.
Well, yeah.
It does not feel like that. I can't... It's like I can't hold it in my head to rotate it.
Yeah.
Telling me to rotate it is like telling me to hold water in my hand.
Right. And of course, there are other explanations of that time difference based on the nature of the unconscious calculations used to determine a match. For our purposes in understanding Dennett, the details of how people actually do it doesn't really matter. What does matter is that subjects say they imagined rotating the shapes, but that doesn't decide between the explanations of how they perform the task. Those need to be tested in experiments. Regardless of whatever our theory of mental rotation ends up being, we also need to explain why subjects believe they imagine rotating the shapes. Maybe they do, maybe they don't do that, but a theory of consciousness needs to explain that belief regardless. So this is an example of the neutrality as to whether or not subjects are right about what is going on in their minds. And this is how we do justice to the first-person perspective. So the subject here cannot be wrong about what they can lie, but assuming they're not lying, then they can't be wrong about what constitutes their subjectivity, their first-person perspective on the task, but they can still be wrong about whether or not it's unconscious maths or some other kind of neural network model building or whatever that underlies their actual performance on the task.
I'm able to tell that it's the same shape because I imagine rotating it in my head. Wow, it's really interesting. It turns out how long it takes me to decide whether it's the same shape depends on how long it would take me to rotate the actual thing in the world. So the more I have to rotate it to get a match, the longer it takes me to say it's the same. And so that's interesting because we can take something about my report about my experience and see whether that might be right. And the fact that the timing matches up is evidence that it might be right.
Right, but then someone else comes along with another theory that says there's a different way of doing the calculation that's also time dependent. I assume that these days there'll be Bayesian versions of it, there'll be dynamic systems theories versions of this and so on, that have all come out since the early 90s when Dennett was first proposing heterophenomenology. So there's all these theories about how mental rotation actually works. At least some subjects are wrong about how they do it, but they're all right about how it seems to them that they do it. So that's just an example of the neutrality. And whatever theory of those options or whatever we end up on, whatever they are in the literature these days, on top of that theory that explains the performance on the task, we need to explain why subjects believe they rotate the images of the shapes in their mind. Perhaps a simpler example comes from mass priming. I don't want to drag this out too much, Liz. I know we're getting tired, but I think it's worth doing this example as well, because Dennett's understanding of priming here in 2003 seems subtly different from his understanding in 1991, which we will come back to when we look at his theory of consciousness. So to get your heads around this, imagine a subject looking at a screen, computer screen, and they're shown a mask, say a series of 4 hashes, followed by a word stem, say FRI dash dash dash. Now, the task is to complete the word stem. Unknown to the subject, a word is flashed very briefly before the mask, before the 4 hashes. Now, as far as the subjects know, they only see the hashes and the word stem. Indeed, in modern examples of this sort of experiment, the timing is set up for individual subjects such that they cannot even guess at better than chance levels if a word appeared before the mask, before the hashes.
First of all, they work out how fast we have to put it up so you can't even guess whether there was something there at all, let alone read it.
Even in those cases, the apparently invisible word still has some effect on subjects. So if the word cold is flashed before the hashes, subjects are more likely to finish the FRI stem with frigid. But if the word scared is flashed, we see more instances of the words fright or frightened.
Whereas when you said FRI, I thought, what word begins with FRI and has 6 letters? And I thought friend.
Yep. Oh.
So I would... Frigid is just not the first word that would pop to my mind.
Yeah.
It didn't, but also it's just a lower frequency word. It's not a word you use as often. That's part of why that's interesting, though, because if it's not a word that you would come up with just when given the stem, it suggests that the invisible word's making a difference.
So we have this scenario where the presentation of the word seems to be affecting subjects' behaviour, but from their subjective point of view, they don't see the word. Dennett asks us to consider a couple of ways of understanding just what's going on here. We might ask if the priming word, cold or scared, is briefly conscious but then erased from memory, or if not that possibility, perhaps the information about that word is only ever processed unconsciously. Now, it's going to get more complicated when we look at the theory Dennett offers later in the series. But for now, the point is that from the point of view of heterophenomenology, there is no difference between these options because there is no way for the subject to tell the difference between them. There's no differences in the subject's beliefs about their experience if the word is briefly conscious and then erased from memory, or if it never reaches consciousness. There's no effect that can have on the subject's belief about their experiences. Either way, they would believe the same things about the scenario, namely that all they saw were the hashes and then the word stem that they had to complete. If it were possible to distinguish these options empirically, subjects would learn something from that about the cognitive work going on in their own minds. And here I'm worried that we see a bit of a tension in Dennett's approach. So it seemed earlier on that for Dennett, subjects can't be wrong about how things seem to them. But Dennett's now going to say that if we could distinguish between these interpretations of mass priming, subjects wouldn't just learn something about their minds, but, quote, subjects would learn for the first time that they were, or were not, conscious of these stimuli when they were taught the theory, end quote. So that can read like a claim about the subject's learning something about how things appear to them in virtue of they're conscious of it or not. Again, we're spending a lot of time today putting some effort into trying to be charitable to Dennett, and I think we should do so again here. I think this attention is merely apparent. When we start studying consciousness with heterophenomenology, we assume subjects are right about their experiences, but we should treat this assumption as revisable given a worked out theory. As he says, quote, "Only when such a theory is in place will we be able, for the first time, to know what we mean when we talk about the experiences themselves, as distinct from what we each subjectively take our experiences to be." End quote. So we started with one answer to Nagel's question about whether or not subjects can be wrong about their experience, but we treat this as a potentially revisable assumption. Different theories of consciousness will have different answers. I just want to finish up with this question of whether heterophenomenology leaves out consciousness completely and means that all we have is beliefs about consciousness. I think it doesn't necessarily, although Dennett's phrasing can sometimes make it seem that way. Definitely, as Dennett points out, opens the door to views on which consciousness is rather less impressive than it's sometimes assumed to be, or at least it's pretty different from how we sometimes assume it to be. The point here is that beliefs of subjects are the data that need to be explained, but data isn't all there is to a phenomena. The data is just how we represent something precisely enough for the purposes of studying it.
So I'm very well aware that the difference, I think, between Dennett and me comes down to our taste or distaste for instrumentalism. Yeah.
So I think that at least with the phrasing of heterophenomenology here, we don't have to go down that line that all there is the measurements.
Yeah, no.
I just want to expand on this idea that, the data is what you have to explain, but that doesn't mean that the data is all there is. So if we think of any measure of anything you like, so maybe a photo of a cell through a microscope, or a bit of carbon paper indicating the position a ball has landed, the height of liquid in a tube. I'll work with that last one. So say you've got 100 ml of water in one tube and 100 ml of ethanol in another. Mm-hmm. You mix them together and you get less than 200 ml of liquid. Mm-hmm. Now, the data that needs to be explained is the height indicating the volume mixture. Mm-hmm. But we don't infer from that all that really exists is the height or the volume. We still think that the mixture is real. The mixture of water and ethanol is real. Realists can still use heterophenomenology like this. Say that the beliefs expressed by subjects' reports are data that needs to be explained by consciousness. But you can still say there is consciousness that the beliefs are about, experiences the beliefs are about. Now, Dennett does make the additional claim, we've seen it here already, and it will become a part of his theory later on, that the subject's beliefs about their experiences constitute their subjective world, how things seem to them. But as we've just seen, this is a revisable assumption that we make to start studying consciousness. It is not the final commitment as to the nature of consciousness. Next time out will be a main series episode where we will be talking about the consciousness of corvids.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah,
cool. Let's call it a day.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.